Last week for class, you were asked to read chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9 in the Red Badge of Courage. So for this week's direct instruction, we're going to review those 4 chapters. Within the review, there are some questions that I would like you to answer. I suggest that you pause the video at those points, answer the question in the submission box for the assignment, and then come back to the video. So let's get started. Chapter 6. In Chapter 6, Henry's mood shifts drastically and quickly. He goes from this state of euphoria to the state of panic right before our eyes. Henry's very proud of himself at the beginning of this chapter. He had proven that he could stand and be courageous. He was able to take part in the battle. However, it's in the very next breath, he's running from the battle. It seems like that amount of courage has just evaporated, and now he's in a panic over what he's taking part in. This brings us to our first question. What do you think about Henry's decision to run? Thinking back to the advice that his mother gave him upon his enlistment, would she have supported this decision? What would you have said to Henry in this chapter if you had the opportunity to speak to him? I suggest, like I said, that you pause the video at this point, answer the question, and then return to the video when you are ready to move on. Chapter 7. In Chapter 7, Henry is making every attempt to justify his decision to run. He tells himself that he did the right thing because he is saving himself to fight another day. At this point, he decides that his fellow soldiers were foolish not to run because they could have been injured, killed, or hurt and won't be able to fight another day. Henry uses nature to support his justification for running. Even animals know when to run. Specifically, he cites a squirrel that is seen running from the scene of the battle. Crane continues to point out the beauties and the tranquilities of nature in this chapter. This is the whole idea that nature is removed from this war and not a part of it. The fact that nature is removed from the war points out the unnaturalness of the war. We need to remember throughout this book that this is a war fought between citizens of the same country. So this is the Civil War, the North versus the South, Americans fighting against one another. And Crane is trying to say that there is a certain unnaturalness to this type of war. In Chapter 8, Henry runs back to the sounds of the battle out of curiosity. He said that it sounded as if the earth and the moon were about to clash, and he's curious as to what's going on, so he returns back to where the battle is. Crane makes some comments in this chapter about war through Henry's thoughts. Things like, why do soldiers battle? Okay. Henry feels that soldiers initially believe that every battle will make them heroes by writing about it in newspapers, including specific instances of bravery. In actuality, only the biggest battles are written about and glorified. Henry decided that this is probably good because if soldiers believe themselves to be great, then they might not be as likely to risk their own lives in battle. Crane uses various stylistic components in this chapter. Synesthesia, the connecting 2 different senses like color and sound. Battle is described as a crimson roar. He also uses figurative language, specifically some similes and personification. We need to remember that similes are the comparison of 2 unlike things using like or as. One of the examples in this chapter being the noise was as the voice of an eloquent being. And personification, which is when we give human characteristics to something that is not human. An example from this chapter being, sometimes the brambles form chains to hold him back. The brambles aren't actually able to hold him back like a person. This brings us to question number 2. This is not the first time, by any stretch of the imagination, that Crane uses figurative language. Remember back to the descriptions of the enemy in earlier chapters. Why do you think that Crane relies on figurative language so often, particularly similes and metaphors? Chapter 9. Henry is constantly reminded of his own lack of courage as he views the red badges of courage of his wounded comrades. Okay, we finally see the meaning of the title of this book, and these red badges are actually the wounds that the soldiers are experiencing. Henry's internal conflict continues throughout this chapter. He wants to be brave, but he just can't seem to be. When faced with an instance of a need to be brave, he freaks out, panics, and runs. In this chapter, Jim dies, which is important to Henry. Henry thought that Jim was invincible, that he couldn't be killed. And Jim had said earlier that if everyone stood and fought, he would too. And in this chapter, Jim makes good on that promise, and even though it has led to his death. So he was brave enough to stand up and fight if everyone else would, regardless of what would happen. Jim also puts the army above his own life. It's symbolic that he leaves the road to die. He moves himself out of the way of those that need to move on without him. His life has ended, but the war has not. So he moves himself off the road to die so that those who need to participate in the war can carry on. This brings us to our third and final question. This chapter emphasizes Henry's inner turmoil, which is at the very heart of this novel. This chapter also sets up a strong contrast between two different types of soldiers, one type portrayed by Henry and the other type portrayed by Jim. Compare and contrast these two characters. What bigger statements do these men's character traits make about soldiers in general? This brings our lecture on chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9 to an end. Please make sure that you answer all 3 questions completely in the submission box for this assignment. As always, if you have any questions about the novel or any of your assignments for this week, please make sure to let me know. Thank you, and have a good week.